Alright, I just got back from The House of the Lost on the Cape. Just saw that in theaters. I believe the Japanese title is Misaki no Mayoiga. Um, and this was definitely an interesting watch. Basic premise of the film is two girls, Yui and Hiyori, through different traumatic circumstances of varying levels, end up at an evacuation shelter after a natural disaster. I believe in the film it is an earthquake. We'll get into the specific background of that in just a bit, but eventually they end up getting adopted, sort of, by this eccentric grandma character who takes them out to this house on a cape, kind of out in the sticks, sort of. But as it turns out, this house has some tricks to it and is not all that it seems. Now, the background for this one is kind of important to understanding what this story is. And they don't exactly hide what it's about. It's about the earthquake, the Tohoku earthquake from 2011. The original, this is based on a serialized children's book, I believe, that was published from 2014 to 2015, so like 3 to 4 years after the big earthquake. And it is very much a direct response to the fallout of that emotionally. And I believe this film was actually like a 10th anniversary project commemorating the disaster. Took a whole year for it to come over to the US. We're getting there, guys. We're getting there. We're slowly getting better at bringing anime films over. But that's kind of one of the big points for this film. Definitely in the second half a lot, and especially towards the climax of the film, is you very much feel this sense of disaster, this sense that so much has been taken from these people that it feels like you really just don't want to go on anymore. And it's kind of not fortuitous, but very coincidental that this movie came out in the midst of COVID as well, because we're honestly feeling a lot of the same sentiments then. It was a much slower disaster than the earthquake was, but it's still a very emotionally relevant film. You get the sense of just this dread hanging over you, and you just want to just run away from it. You just want to leave everything and just go away. You do not want to be a part of this anymore. And that definitely shows up near the climax of this film. And that lead up to that climax, I think it does that very well. The first bulk of the film, however, is notably slower and much more toned down in its emotional resonance. Although it still does have stuff here and there. This is where the actual staff for this series comes in. This was directed by Shinya Kawatsura, I believe, who is the director of Non Non Biyori and Tanaka-kun. And it's very much got that vibe to it. This is a very slow, very ponderous kind of show. And combine that with the screenwriter, Reiko Yoshida, who really doesn't need any introduction at this point, but if you don't know her, she's been behind a lot of the big KyoAni works, K-On!, Tamako Market, Liz and the Bluebird, and she also worked with she works with Naoko Yamada a lot. Most recently, I believe she also wrote for the Heike story last year. So, big time anime writer. She's done a ton of other stuff besides that too, but I believe she was also the writer for Non Non Biyori as well. So we've got that kind of director-writer tag team here. coming back to echo some of that kind of narrative aesthetic again. This is a very slow moving, very ponderous kind of film. The emotions don't come at you like hard and fast. This is a very like creeps up on you kind of movie, for better or for worse. And honestly, if I'm being honest, it's mostly for worse in this case. This is a very slow movie. And again, it's adapted from a children's book, so it's got that element to it as well, where you can see like all the different, you can very much see like the different chapters being segmented off, like here's a story, here's a story, here's a story, here's a story. I think they could have bridged those segments together a little more, but that's not really my biggest complaint with this film. My biggest complaint is that it's just so plain and unengaging a lot of the time. Like, I get that it's adapted from a children's book and you can't go too heavy on the sad. Like, you can't just go full depressing grimdark. But the first good chunk of this film, basically nothing happens. Like, you hear, and I hate using that phrase, nothing happens, but nothing significant happens aside from telling us the two main characters' backstories and why they ended up the way they were there. Aside from that, it's just a series of them like having these weird, quirky interactions with the house that honestly are not all that weird and quirky. Like, it's very standard. I think that's probably my biggest problem with this, is it's very standard. There's not a lot of uniqueness or creativity to this setting that they've created, this supernatural-ish kind of house that's got some, it's got some supernatural elements to it. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it's very traditionally like yokai supernatural stuff. But they don't really do it in an interesting way, except for there's a part with some kappas that I thought was pretty fun. Now, I could see someone make the argument that they are trying to present the supernatural as mundane in this story, but I don't think they really pulled that off either. So it's kind of in this weird middle ground where it is still wacky and supernatural, but also they're just kind of playing it straight. So I don't think the combination that they had there worked quite well for this film. And it's a bit lacking in character overall as well. Like, I will say, Yui is probably the most developed character in this movie. The way she has to move past the emotional traumas of her before she met up with Hiyori and the grandma character. I forgot what the grandma's name was. I think it was Kiwa, I think. The way she has to move past that part of her life and readapt to a new circumstance was pretty engaging to see. But again, there's not a whole lot to it. It's kind of just like things happen to her. And again, this is another point where I'm kind of torn on how I feel about it, because a lot of this film is just these two kids getting given stuff. Like, they just get a whole lot of things to make their lives better. And obviously they like work to appreciate those things, I guess. But it's very much, and at first I was reading this as a the world is just wants to naturally be kind to them after they've experienced these traumas. It's definitely a flip on the world. It's very much a reverse of the world is cruel and unforgiving. This is much more of the world is kind and wants to help you. And so I appreciate that idea, but just from a narrative standpoint, it kind of just kills any stakes whatsoever. But really, in terms of characterization, my biggest problem is Hiyori, this little girl who, it's pretty early on in the film. It mentions that she lost her parents in a car crash. She is mute for most of the film up until the climax, and it really kills her characterization because she is basically just an object up until her big climactic moment. She really, she has emotions, but most of those emotions are cute elementary school girl who just wants people to be kind and get along until something triggers her trauma, and then she just goes to hide and stuff. She's a very binary character, and it just kind of makes the way she's written is just not particularly compelling, and I did not care for her at all until the climax of this film. And the climax is pretty solid, although it's very abrupt in its pacing. It very much comes on fast and then goes away fast. Which I think my personal theory on that is just that is not something that these staff are accustomed to writing, because it is much more of an action-y climax, and it's very jarring in comparison to the rest of the film. I don't think it's out of place, but it has that come on fast, go away fast kind of feel to it, almost like it was just get in, get out, we gotta get on with it. But yeah, this is just a very unengaging film. And you might say, well, that's where the aesthetic of the film comes in. And I would agree, if not for the fact that this film is also very plain looking. Character designs aren't particularly noteworthy. Really the only animation that's noteworthy is sometimes we'll get some cool background art. I do like how they portray these areas that have been battered by the earthquake and the tsunami, and the damage that we see from that. I do like that part of it, and sometimes we'll get some cool nature shots. But aside from that, there's really nothing interesting to look at in this film. There are also a couple moments of I can only describe them as shots that will end up in a compilation video on Twitter with the caption, "Anime food looks so good." That's what I would describe those shots as. You're going to see those shots in the next 3 to 4 months circling around on Twitter. But aside from that, it's very not very engaging to look at. There's nothing else. All of those good things that I mentioned are kind of rare or uncommon in the film itself. Mostly it's just the characters existing in a slightly rundown city. Again, the character designs aren't particularly interesting. There are a couple weird editing issues here and there. And overall, the just general framing and shot composition and cinematography is just very plain and boring and just super standard. There's not a whole lot to this. And on top of that, when it tries to do CG environments and stuff, it sticks out noticeably. So, those are the moments where the camera actually moves, and it really shows. So it kind of fails on a narrative level, and the aesthetic don't really back up the narrative. This is just not a particularly good-looking film. It's not ugly by any degree, but it's just not good-looking. This is from narrative to aesthetic to pacing, it's just all very mediocre. And I appreciate the ideas that it has in it. I really do. I really love the ideas that it has in it. There were actually a couple points where I was actually feeling a little emotional because those ideas are things that I resonate with a lot as of late. But I just wish they were in a more competent film. So yeah, I don't think I would really recommend seeing this one. Apparently there are more showings going on over the weekend, which I am surprised by, but I can't exactly say go and rush out to see it unless if you're like a Non Non Biyori fan, maybe you'll get a kick out of this. Personally, I'm not particularly partial to the series. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the House of the Lost on the Cape. I hate to give this a bad score because I do love the ideas that it has, but it's just not well executed ideas. So I think for this one I'm gonna go with like probably a strong 4, maybe a light 5. I don't see myself recommending this one. So yeah, that's it for this review. Next week, I believe, is Goodbye Don Glees, so hopefully that one will be a little bit better than this. But until then, my name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.